Hey church, I need to share with you some really difficult decisions that have been a part of our week as a community. And because they're difficult decisions and because I want to communicate really thoughtfully, I'm working from my notes here, so please forgive that I'm not trying to be disingenuous or inauthentic. I just want to make sure that I communicate in a way that's as thoughtful as possible. Before I describe what we've had to decide this week, let me just kind of give you some context. In April and again in June, we shared in gatherings on the podcast and through the email newsletter that general fund giving had declined over previous years and it was falling below our budgeted expenses. Specifically, in our update at the end of June, we communicated that our general fund giving was roughly $112,000 short of our budgeted expenses halfway through the year. That trend has continued through the summer, leaving us further in deficit with a declining cash reserve. While this trend is troubling, to be honest, it's not entirely surprising. We've heard from friends and leadership at a lot of other churches that they're seeing something similar as people really begin to put their lives back together in the wake of the pandemic. We know a lot of businesses are facing similar decisions about what to do about declining money. It's also the case that in terms of like Sunday attendance, our church is a lot smaller than it was before COVID, even though I think what we've figured out is there's a lot of reach. It's just that life looks different after COVID and people come less frequently, but all of that affects our resource picture. One of the reasons we want to have that kind of transparency with you, like throughout the year, is so that if we came to the point where we had to make some hard decisions, we wanted to make sure that you had some context for it and you weren't entirely caught off guard. Well, we recently crossed the line where we can no longer wait to make significant cuts. And specifically, we've had to cut our general budget by roughly $150,000. In light of this general fund shortfall, I want to briefly mention that some of you may be wondering about the Tribune project, the big building project that we're doing, and whether it's financially sustainable or whether it's still a good idea. Just a couple of quick reminders about that. One, part of the reason we chose to do the Tribune project after lots of communal discernment was that in the long run, it actually ends up being frugal. Once we get in there and get into our mortgage payment, we'll be paying far less in mortgage there than we're paying in rent here at Studebaker. The other thing I'll point out is that in spite of this growing deficit in the general fund, the Tribune project giving has been really strong. And we keep separate funds, right? We've told you this before, like if dollars are designated for the Tribune fund, they stay with that project. We cannot and we will not move money from a designated fund to a general fund to solve a general fund problem. Same goes for our care fund. Care fund dollars stick with the care fund. The adoption and foster care support fund, those dollars stay with adoption and foster care support. Tribune dollars that stay with the Tribune, and then general fund is what we're left with to pay for our life together as a community. This is also why during the Tribune Project fundraising process, we tried to say very, very clearly that it's important that you don't take money that you give to the general fund and redirect it toward the Tribune Project. As we've been watching this general fund trend, we've tried a few things to try to address it. We've looked at subletting our space right here in Studebaker. We've explored the possibility of a weekday tenant who could share the rent load with us, but that's not yielded any solutions. We've pursued a number of grants in the past few months, although it's exceptionally rare for grants to exist to cover general fund expenses. That's just not usually how grants are created. And we've repeatedly reevaluated every part of our budget. We've looked at everything dedicated to ministry support and operations, but the fact is we run a very lean budget already in those areas, and there just isn't enough to cut to make the difference. That means that the only remaining possibility to cut that $150,000 is in our staffing, which means losing positions through layoffs. I want to tell you a little bit about how we deliberated in the decision-making process here. Matt Grable, our executive pastor, and I spent hours working through this question together and with our board. In our deliberations on which staff roles to eliminate or reduce, none of our roles was exempt from consideration, and believe me, there were no easy answers. We grappled with institutional history, staff diversity. We considered the unique contribution of each person on our team. But the problem with those personal considerations is that they got us nowhere, frankly, because every person on our team is essential in all sorts of ways, both in terms of what they contribute and in terms of who they are. And like, frankly, you get this right, like nobody deserves a layoff. That's not the point. That's not what we're saying. It's just a brutal financial reality for staffing. So it's not like considering the people in these roles got us any closer to figuring it out, because nobody deserves this. And so the only consideration left for us was to ask ourselves, based on what we can afford in a prudent budget with the right kind of staff allocation, how many roles can we afford, and what are the most essential ones in terms of what we do as a community? And as I take you through how we came out on that, I know you may have a difference of opinion on this, and we can certainly talk more about that later. But before I get any further, please hear me again. None of these decisions had anything to do with job performance. This is purely financial-based layoffs. I just want to make sure that's really, really clear. The new budget that we put together to make up for that $150,000 deficit affected 3 of our current staff roles, with 2 of them going from full-time positions to part-time positions, and 1 of them going away altogether. Now, that's what we had on paper. We were trying to figure out how to salvage some roles here, which is why, as we built the budget, we imagined a couple of these full-time positions going part-time. However, we knew going into it that it's one thing to have that on paper, it's another thing to talk to someone about whether they can afford to go part-time, or whether they, upon figuring out what else they're going to do to make up for the lost wages and healthcare and other benefits for themselves and their family, like whether there's room for that kind of a role. And so we came out of the gate on Tuesday talking to the team about some of these changes. But I think what we realized later in the week is that we were probably a little bit naive about that, and I think we probably had too many assumptions about how easy of a consideration that would be, or whether that would work for people. So by the time we got to Thursday, frankly, it was clear that some of what we were proposing wasn't working the way that we thought it would. And so late Thursday, we revised that plan, and our team is just beginning to process these new updated changes. If this sounds messy, it is. And I think I'll just speak for myself right now and say hindsight's 2020. I wish it hadn't been so messy this week, but this is just where we are right now. Because some of this is still in flux, I don't have an entirely clear picture to offer you today on everything about where this will land. What I can tell you right now is that we'll be losing 2 positions. Ryan Yeasel's role as pastor for City Connection, and Amanda Harris's role as director of administration. You need to know that in communicating these decisions with our team, we've tried to say as loudly and clearly as possible, you're still deeply wanted here, your voice and your presence. But we also understand there's a lot of emotion to process for somebody who's just found out that they're losing their job. I'm sure you're wondering about our care for Amanda and Ryan. Our plan all along this week has been that anybody whose job is affected would have 3.5 months of full pay and benefits. That goes through November 30th. That's us stretching our capacity for severance as far as is possible in light of the financial realities I already told you about. But we feel like it's right to do that, to do everything we can to extend as much care as possible for as long as we can. There are no strings attached to that severance, which means you may not see Amanda or Ryan around on a Sunday. They're still processing all this and trying to figure out if or when they want to be around. It's not because they're not welcome here. It's simply because we want to make sure that they're able to have whatever space they need in this transitional season. And so each of them is taking the lead and deciding what that might look like between now and the end of November. Whatever support we can provide them in terms of transition to new work, we want to do that. And that's those of us in leadership helping them do that, but that might be one of you too. You might know about a position, maybe you yourself are trying to hire for something, or maybe you're aware of an opportunity out there. This is another way that we can walk alongside them right now and help them prepare for what's going to be next in their lives. We're also thinking a lot about celebration, celebrating them. When the time is right, we'll be celebrating and saying thank you. And although that'll probably look different for each of them, because they're different people and loving different people looks different for each person, we're looking forward to celebrating that when the time is right. You also might be wondering how this affects church life and programs, etc. The honest answer is we don't know a lot right now. Once it became clear that staff cuts were necessary, we felt that it was urgent for us to make those decisions and then communicate them without delay, because like every day that we wait to make these decisions is one less day that we can afford to pay severance. And we just felt that the most honoring thing to do was to make these decisions and communicate them so that people could begin thinking about what's next while they have that severance coverage. It means that we don't have a lot of answers right now about the many areas that both Ryan and Amanda lead for us. I'm sure a lot of you are going to have questions or concerns about all of this. For the next 2 Sundays, August 21st and 28th, I'll be meeting with anyone who's interested after both the 9 a.m. and 11 a.m. gatherings to hear your questions and respond. We'll do that in the mezzanine living area right upstairs here. You can also email us at info@southatstudychurch.com, and we'll be sure to respond. I wish I had better news for you today, but thanks for taking the time to understand all of this. Grace and peace, friends.